Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On this week's episode, we talked to Rob Geen, who is leading the new child welfare initiative started by the Bipartisan Policy Center. Some of the initiative's early actions include a national survey on public attitudes and views about the child welfare system, a landscape assessment based on interviews with those who are working within child welfare or who have been impacted by child welfare policy, and a review of state child welfare legislative activity that kind of breaks things down by political affiliations of sponsors and authors, success rate based on different types of legislation, what have you. Geen talked to us about how the ball got rolling on all of this with the center, which includes concern on his part and others involved in setting it up that the discussion around child welfare had become polarized in a way where substantive conversations about improving the system had become difficult. So we talked to him about that. We also discussed the findings from the national survey and the legislative assessment. I think the landscape stuff had not come out when we recorded this, just before the holidays. And we also talked about Geen's view of what bipartisanship means in this space of child welfare, which is different, in his view, than the traditional interpretation of bipartisanship as defined by, Democrats and Republicans joining together. So without further ado, here is our interview with Rob Geen of the Child Welfare Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center. All right, we are joined today by Rob Geen, who is leading the Bipartisan Policy Center's new Child Welfare Initiative, which launched at the end of 2023 with some public polling, some stakeholder focus groups, a 50-state analysis of recent trends in legislation around child welfare. We'll talk about all that and more. Rob, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We give everybody a chance to tell the listeners a little bit about themselves before we get into the weighty stuff. I'm going to give you the categories. You got to give me at least one favorite. TV show or movie, sports team. I know the answer to that one. Musical group or book. You got to give me one. You can give me more. Rob, what do you got?
So a combo platter. I am a huge baseball fan. And so the Washington Nationals are my home team. And not surprisingly, my favorite movie that I've seen probably 100 times and can quote from is Bull Durham, the best sports movie ever.
Solid two-part answer there. What do you think of the Nats prospects here? They're starting around the corner again.
I think it's going to be another 2 years before we see competitive baseball, but the climb up is almost as fun as seeing them succeed.
There you go. That's a good way to look at it. I agree. Okay, so this Bipartisan Center initiative, let's start with just simply the origin story. When did this start to come about? I'm assuming you were kind of early in on the conversation, so give us the genesis.
Yeah, so it was almost 2 years ago to this month. It was during the holidays, and I started feeling the mood in our field becoming more negative, more combative. And I started feeling bad about that. So I started journaling for myself, just writing down thoughts that I was having, things that I was hearing, and trying to make sense of it. And it was therapeutic for me. And I shared it with a colleague, and they said, well, you're in a position of privilege at a foundation. Why don't you do something about it? So I started talking to folks. They said, let's put a project together. So we started talking about an opportunity just to bring folks together in a different way. And the leadership at the Casey Foundation was interested, suggested, let's reach out to some of our foundation partners, see if they're feeling, seeing, hearing similar things, and whether there would be interest. And so that quickly turned into a multi-funder conversation. People were hearing the same things and a desire to move it forward. Fast forward, the foundations came together and selected the Bipartisan Policy Center as a host organization.
So, in the context of this initiative's aims in the center, how would you define bipartisan as a pursuit? For example, there's a concern expressed in kind of your guys' opening language about polarization, and we'll talk about state analysis stuff later. But there's been significant legislative efforts where you might describe ultra conservative and liberal politicians coming together. So, like, in your mind, I guess what I'm asking is, like, what is the definition of bipartisan and things that you're trying to see? Would you read that as centrist, or how would you elaborate on your view of that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of points here. One is people think of polarization in political terms, and that doesn't have to necessarily be the case. We can be polarized and share a political party or a political affiliation. I think what I was feeling and the mood that I was hearing was one of an either or choice in a lot of things rather than a both and. Conversations that were meant to end rather than to start, and just not having the dialogue that I think is necessary to bring diverse perspectives together. So when I think of bipartisan, I'm not even thinking necessarily in a political way. What I'm thinking of is, how do we bring different perspectives together to have a more robust discussion to have more positive outcomes? At the same time, we can't divorce ourselves from politics. And it's good to realize that, when we kick off the next year, there will be 40 states that have trifecta governments, which means the governor and the legislature are of the same party. So 80% of children in the United States will be in states with a trifecta government. So if we want to push ideas forward that cover the large percentage of kids in the United States, we have to be thinking about talking about ideas, selling ideas to people with different perspectives if we want to be successful.
I was going to ask you about that later in the state analysis part, but I guess I'll ask you now. As it pertains to these trifecta governments, I think one might just on the surface assume those are the places where it's least likely to achieve a bipartisan nature, and that you just go after whatever party is running the show and get them to do it. But is that incorrect? I mean, is there a tether in those states in particular to getting the sign-on of the minority party?
So I think child welfare has historically been a bipartisan issue. There will be those who disagree with it on the fringes around early prevention, not necessarily being bipartisan as much. But the vast majority of what we discuss in child welfare has been bipartisan. So I don't think the approach needs to necessarily be vastly different in one state than another. I think we need to think about it outside of that political context. People share common values. They express them oftentimes in different ways, but tapping into those shared values is something that will give us longevity. My biggest fear has always been, what would happen if child welfare turned into an abortion issue or a gun rights issue where we had red child welfare states and blue child welfare states? I don't see that happening. At one point, I had a little bit of a fear that we might eventually get down that way. But I think hopefully this project will keep that bipartisan nature moving forward.
Yeah, you alluded to this already, but in your guys' language, you kind of referred to in your stakeholder meetings that there are a lot of people that express that the field feels combative. I'm going to quote here that individuals yearn for space to discuss issues and raise questions without fear of judgment or being canceled. And I guess I'm curious from those interviews and those discussions, if you could elaborate a little more, especially on the canceled part. Like, is that more of I'm not saying either one of these wouldn't be concerning, but like, is that more perceived or concrete? Did you actually hear from people who, report personally or knowing people who lost jobs, lost work as a result of expressing views?
Yes and yes. There were a number of people. And what I think is important here is that this wasn't one individual. It wasn't one type of stakeholder. We were very intentional in our landscape analysis in speaking to any type of stakeholder who would talk to us. We did have a core group of people who were those who were most directly affected by the system, both birth parents and young people, but also social workers, of foster parents, adoptive parents, system leaders. So people who are very close to the system, as well as outsiders to it. And we heard similar things. And those conversations often were, I want to be able to present my authentic self and say, I don't have all the answers and I'm uncertain. And I hear things on two sides of an argument that I both find interesting and want to learn more about. But if I express uncertainty, I am suddenly being disloyal or not aligned enough with the right tribe that I'm supposed to be aligned with, and people are going to judge me. And that did lead to people being asked to leave their organization, particularly when they were more on the advocacy side and they were raising questions about holes in arguments.
Would you say that was cross-directional? I mean, I don't want this interview to sound like we're sneaking around. I mean, there's obviously a big contingent, a significant group of people that are calling for abolition of this child welfare system. There are people who feel like we should have much more involvement with families and probably take more people into foster care and do more of that. Was your sense that either side, there is that consequence when you try to just ask questions?
Yeah, I think when a leader is willing to speak out in a nuanced way and say yes, but most people don't hear the yes, they hear the but. And being able to qualify and to really push forward in their understanding puts them at risk. I think you bring a good example with the abolition movement and the who brings the question of how large or who should be in the system. We take an issue like mandatory reporting. There are a group of folks who would like to see mandatory reporting completely ended. There's a group of folks who would like to see mandatory reporting become mandatory for everybody or significantly expanded. I am personally not aware of research that supports either of those points of views. What I do believe is that both of those sides that are making those arguments are not happy with our current system. So that's something to work with. That is saying, all right, we both understand that what's going on right now is not actually achieving our outcome. So when you take a look at state legislation, when you take a look at views of the public, you see a very moderate perspective. You see, why don't we improve what we're doing? Why don't we better train mandatory reporters? Why don't we clarify what actually is abuse and neglect? And you get to that point and you see quite a bit of agreement and the potential for movement.
Let's get into the survey that you guys did, because this has probably been a long time coming. It's kind of honestly, I don't want to date you here, but you've been in child welfare policy for a long time. Do you recall somebody doing a large sample public perception survey like you guys did here before we get into it?
Yes, I have been in the field for very long, 35 years plus. I went back and looked at large scale surveys, and the only one that I could find, which was unpublished, was from the Pew Commission. And they asked a fairly limited number of questions. I will say that I've had this idea of public polling for quite some time. I've had a number of folks suggest, the public doesn't really understand child welfare. These questions are far too complex to be able to get the average citizen to be able to respond. And that was a legitimate concern going into this research. We selected the Harris firm as a polling firm. They had prior experience in child welfare, having done the adoption attitude survey and other work. But in particular, they sold us on this idea of doing some qualitative work before we got into the polling. They wanted to get a group of folks together to really understand, how can you ask these questions? And the poll could have stopped there. It could have been possible that after we talked to 20 people, the types of questions that we wanted to ask were just not doable through a traditional poll. But it was confirmation, frankly, that the public understands a lot more than we give them credit for. So just the fact that we were able to do the survey, I think, is important.
Yeah, we should get into that, because I do think there's places where I was interested in the public's. I'm sure there are for you as well, and ones where I did find it was contradictory, in some ways. So before I don't want to preload it with the things I'm excited to talk about. So just before I ask Rob what jumped out to him the most, details on this thing, I think it was about 3,600 and change people that are in the samples. There's a lot of people. they oversampled in Ohio and Georgia, so that you got a kind of more robust look at, what people's perceptions are in those two states. So
let me just clarify.
Yeah, please.
It was
go ahead.
a nationally representative survey with 2016, I believe, people. And then there were state representative samples in Georgia and in Ohio. We did not combine the samples. So we don't report on the 3,600. We do report on them separately. I will say that if you go into the survey findings and the data on the BPC website, you see very few differences between Georgia and Ohio and the US. That was important to confirm to us that we were hearing the right thing. We did some significant qualitative work in Georgia and Ohio, which is why we selected those states for the state samples. So technically, it's not a 3,600 sample; it's 2,800 and 800.
Okay, there you go. So that's better context. What findings from the survey of the public, were most significant to you in helping to shape the early agenda of this? I'm assuming that's sort of how it went. You got the findings, and that informed sort of early thoughts on where you'd go with this. So
yes, the public polling was important for us. The shaping of our focus really came from the landscape assessment. The landscape assessment was done simultaneous with the public polling, but we really wanted to land where the field was suggesting were the opportunities. So there are certainly significant overlaps between what we heard in the landscape assessment and what we heard from the public. But I don't want folks to believe that, we heard this from the public, and which is why we're moving forward. I would say there are a number of findings that I think are critical from the polling. One is the public does understand and appreciate the complexity of child welfare. They understand in many ways the difference, or at least I think they understand the difference between abuse and neglect. We asked a lot of balance questions, trying to get at when there is uncertainty, where do you land? We found that the public was very moderate in their response. They wanted to see child welfare deal with the complexity. So they see the dual mission of child welfare as keeping kids safe and strengthening families. That was nice to see. I was afraid, given media, not just the imprint, but much more popular media, that the public might have more of an inclination towards child protection. We didn't necessarily see that. We saw a very balanced view from them in that. We saw a tremendous amount of faith in birth parents being able to adequately, safely, lovingly care for their children when they get resources, even when they've been reported for abuse and neglect. So I thought that was very important. We saw the shared responsibility that the public wants the government and communities to have. They don't think that the government should do this alone. They think the government needs to be involved, but they definitely see a role for faith-based communities and other communities. The public support for kinship care, which reflected what we heard in our stakeholder interviews, was very, very telling. There is definitely this perspective that we should be engaging and supporting relatives when children have to be considered for removal.
That seemed to be the most unequivocal. Would you agree? It really seemed like across the board, whenever you brought kin into questions, that it was, this needs to be your priority.
Yeah, and John, you referenced my long history in child welfare. I have a long history in kinship care. And I do remember a time when I don't think this is the response that we would get from a public poll. And I don't think it is the response we would have gotten universally in our stakeholder interviews. So whatever the kinship advocacy community has been up to for the last 20 years, there's been a shift. We still have work to do. We can't ignore the polling question that was, should you be wary of kin as well? And there was a significant percentage who said, yeah, be wary. And we still heard that in some of the stakeholder interviews. But I think that the both and again there works well, which is let's prioritize kin. Let's make sure that the kin are going to be able to care for children, but that should be a priority. So I don't see that as a mixed message. I see that as a more nuanced understanding.
Before I was adopted, I felt like Felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
Okay, so a few that jumped out to me. Actually, I'm going to start with one that I was just before we talked. I was having coffee with a researcher we both know. I'm not going to say her name because she didn't know I was going to ask it or anything like that. But I had her. She was looking through the polling stuff, and what really terrified her was this one. Ultimately, 2/3 of Americans think that overall child neglect and abuse is intentional or willful on the parent's part, not simply a product of circumstances. And her kind of takeaway was like, that's very dangerous because it's very wrong, in her opinion, in a way that would jeopardize selling the right policies and strategies in a world where the public does have a say at the end of the day with politicians,
Yeah, I think that is a striking finding. We asked the reverse as well, which was to the extent to which abuse and neglect is contribution of multiple circumstances beyond the parent's control. And there were many, many fewer who suggested that be the case. It is a finding that is striking and something that we need to understand better. I will say I was also surprised, and will be coming out with subgroup analyses shortly, that when you take a look at the subgroups, there are not significant differences. So this isn't like, well, 2/3 of the sample believe this, and they're unique because of their political affiliation or their lived experience or their race or whatever. You basically got the same answers regardless of what subgroup you looked at.
So I thought from a policy perspective, I thought the most interesting, and you brought up mandatory reporting earlier, is this, what I see, I'm interested in your opinion on, is like, it seemed like a dichotomy in the discussion about when child welfare should investigate. So most people, leaned towards investigate every report, and most said they would, and away from only investigate reports where there's compelling evidence that abuse or neglect has occurred, right? But then when you ask them, when would you report or when should people report, they basically, to me, Rob, it read like they were giving the very definition of compelling evidence. Like they were saying, like, lean towards investigative or report, but in their minds, like, yeah, reports only would happen when there is this clear firsthand knowledge or very strong sense of something happening. So it felt reading it like squaring that circle could lead to some agreement on some change. I don't know.
Yes, and this will get us into the work that we're going to be moving forward with in the new year. The question of when do all of these circumstances rise to the level of child protection is a question that the public has. It's a question that the field has. The public wanted to see evidence. They wanted to see a higher level of evidence than I think is at least in statute in many states. So they want firsthand knowledge. But what is the firsthand knowledge of? And it is striking that they see circumstances and they say, we want eyes on this child. So if you think about it in those balanced questions, at the front end of the system, the public tends to be a little bit more on the protection side. But as you look further into the system, they're very much in keeping families together. And so they lean much more towards, even when there is risk, let's keep this family together. And when you look at, length of stay versus reunification, they tend to focus reunification. And so this part of the system is an area where we need to do more education. We need to do explanation. And I think within our own field, we need to understand, when do situations that are more financially related put a child at significant risk such that eyes on that child are necessary by a child protective system?
Yeah, that was kind of relates to my next one. But I just going back to this on the reporting side for a minute, it really did kind of feel like it would have been, you can only get people in a room to do a poll for so long and ask them so many questions. But man, it would have been, had those people who responded in a certain way known, that there's millions of reports, and just a huge percentage of them that is the last time they're factored in. And I know that some people would think, well, that's a problem too. You're right, but like how many reports there are and how many go nowhere, would that change your mind, about the reporting system? Would be really interesting. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and we intend to follow up with another poll at some point. And there have already been lots of suggestions on follow-up questions that we should ask. Now that we've done this once, I think we have a better sense of where we need to dive a little bit deeper. I will say that we asked only one qualitative question on the entire poll because that takes longer. Then you have to code the qualitative response. It takes a lot of work. And the one question we asked was, when does poverty become a child protective issue? And Harris analyzed the qualitative responses, and most of the responses were about lack of necessities. So when a child is going hungry, when a child doesn't have a place to sleep. And so there is confusion in the public response between poverty and neglect, as there is within our field right now.
Yeah, and that ties into kind of the next one that jumped out to me was you guys listed on the thing I saw, the three responses that had the highest in terms of public opinion on when child welfare should be involved, and then the three lowest. On the highest, I was really shocked at those three. I would have, if you had to, I feel like I can't go back in time and not have seen it, but I think I would have guessed sexual abuse 1. I think I would have guessed drug use 2, and that is not what it was. It was prenatal exposure was very different. And then the 3 answers were that, domestic violence, and help me out, what is the one I am missing that was in that list? Oh, signs of physical abuse. So I mean that would be in my guess list. So I was just a little surprised by those as the top 3. And then going the other way, the 3 with the least likely, I guess you could look at it as good, but then you would look at it as like half of people responded like, yeah, child welfare should jump in when a family's homeless. It's like, yikes. That's a lot of people thinking that,
Yeah, and it gets to this public education question, which is, do we want to intervene in all of those situations? Right. And when you had more than 50% of respondents suggest that when a child is showing lack of hygiene, that requires a child protective services investigation. And in the introduction to that question, we explained what an investigation entailed. They did have some understanding of what we were talking about, and it was consistent from the qualitative interviews throughout. So that's what the public is telling us right now and tells us what the work we have to move forward.
Last one on this, the adoption findings. So if I had to describe them in one, sort of phrase, the public really felt strongly that you better exhaust options with kin and relatives before you even consider it. You should be giving a pathway for kids to have a real connection with their biological families, and that you should be taking time to really try and match up kids on racial and ethnic grounds, which that last one is spicy because currently we have a federal law going in the other direction on that. What did you think seeing, digesting that the public views there on adoption?
So I agree with your summary, except with the third one, which I think that the message there is, and it's consistent with federal law, is that agencies should be doing their work to recruit foster and adoptive parents that look like the children who need placement. I think that's different from the quote unquote matching that you were alluding to. So I think that is all positive. Again, the support for kin is very strong there. We see that across all groups. We can't ignore the data that we don't like. And there was a question about whether once adopted, it is better for children to keep a distance from their biological families.
You're right.
And there was a non-insignificant number who suggested that. And so that is still something that we need to understand. So that is, again, getting to the nuance of it. So there's this support for making sure that foster parents and adoptive parents know, all right, you have to figure out how to allow these kids to have a safe relationship with other siblings, with birth families. But a number of people saying, Yeah, but maybe it's better that they don't have contact.
And I am far from a mathematician, but it seemed like based on the percentages, there were at least some people in the public who said that they should have a meaningful connection, but also that they should avoid biological families, which was like hard to get your head around. But
yeah, so the way I interpret that is, well, as an adoptive parent, you need to prepare them, and you need to do it. You may think it's best that that they don't, but if they're going to do it, make sure that you give them the tools to make sure they're safe as they maintain relationships.
Yeah. So as I mentioned up top, the Bipartisan Center has also conducted this 50-state legislative analysis. I'm sure more is going to come out about this. Rob was nice enough for the purposes of an interview to kind of give me an early peek. So you guys identified, and I should say this is in the 2022-23 window, so like a 2-year legislative cycle, 567 bills, 26% of them passed. It's actually a pretty high rate, I feel like. And, bipartisan bills account for 25% of the introduced bills, 38% of the passed bills. So I guess right there you have a little bit of like a correlative, not causative suggestion that it's better to be bipartisan if you want it to pass right there. But anything, I guess I'd love to hear from you, Rob, is just like what you think of the bill subjects. Like, you guys have it really broken down to the public. Anybody, I'll drop a link to what is available when we do this, but it does a great job to kind of break these into the nature of the bill, whether it's reporting or parental rights or just about the conditions of foster care. So, like, did anything jump out to you as like, wow, there was a lot of activity on this or that?
What stood out to me is how much overlap there is. Even when we say, well, that was a bill that was introduced by Republicans, or this was a bill that was introduced by Democrats, you'll see a bill from a deep red state where Republicans introduce something, and then you see a similar bill from a blue state with Democrats introducing it. So there is more overlap in interest and in direction than one might expect by just putting an R or a D next to their name. So I think that's important. And it's also a very hopeful sign for me that there is a lot of opportunity to bring people together. There were some issues where there was just a lot of activity, particularly around foster youth and keeping families together. There's a lot there. There are a few areas where you see real differences between the parties and how they want to approach an issue. But when you look more deeply, it suggests potential avenues forward. So there's an example there with termination of parental rights. The Democratic bills are more limiting of termination of parental rights. The Republican bills are more in expanding that or speeding it up. But if you take a look at the overlap, there's interest in making this a fair process. And that also corresponds to a lot of what we see at the front end of the system too. So on the investigations and the levels of evidence and mandatory reporting, there is a sense from both sides that we need to protect parents' rights and that we need to treat parents fairly. And parents' rights is one of those terms that when we get back to the front of our discussion, we talk about polarization. That type of rhetoric has kept people away from coming together on issues that we might suggest as a parents' rights issue.
Do you feel like this breakdown of this particular cycle is a pretty representative one? I mean, you've watched legislative activity for a while. Is it pretty representative, or you think it's more reflective, of our particular time? I guess, like, for example, like the Indian Child Welfare Act, obviously there's an enormous case that affirmed it in its existence, and there was a lot of state activity around codifying ICWA and things like that this year. So I thought, maybe that is disproportionately higher than it would. But do you feel like it was pretty much par for the course or no?
I think that this is only a 2-year look, and it's only taking a look at what's been introduced. So you also have to take into account what already exists in states. So there are lots of states who already have policies and have had policies on the books for 10 years. And now some new states are coming on board to something that's already been done. And we're going to be looking at that and putting out more contextual information so that people understand, all right, so this is adding to a list of already enacted bills. What I do see are the issues that are rising to the top in the last 2 years are things where there's been a lot of discussion. You mentioned ICWA. We saw a lot of ICWA activity in the last 2 years. Maybe shouldn't be shocking with a Supreme Court case with Rob Geen and others. We saw a lot of discussion about narrowing the definition of neglect. I don't know for a fact if we did that analysis 5 years ago, if we would have had the same level of attention. My gut suggests probably not, because what you see is the legislators do respond to what they're hearing from constituents.
Hey there, lovely listeners. Ivory Bennett here, and I am beyond thrilled to welcome you to Interviews, my podcast where I spill the tea on healing, holistic health, and all things tantalizing. Join me for anecdotes about my life and engaging conversations with friends and lived experts offering diverse perspectives. With 17 years of lived experience in foster care, this journey is a collective practice of vulnerability, growth, and resilience. Interviews isn't just about my solo adventures, it's a community-driven exploration of laughter, introspection, and a whole lot of fun. Get ready for real talk with real experiences. You can listen to Interviews on Safe Camp Audio, your go-to for content that speaks to your mind, heart, and soul. If you're ready for a podcast that's entertaining, insightful, and all about self-discovery, hit that subscribe button now. Interviews, where every episode is a celebration of growth and resilience. Subscribe and join the conversation. I can't wait to see you there.
So getting back to kind of big picture on the center, you talked about the origin of it. How would you describe the goal here? Is the overriding goal to distill for policymakers what common ground exists in a sea of some polarity, some disagreement, or is it to kind of create new ideas for policy off of what what's the goal in your mind?
Yeah, so I think I should be clear that we are not attempting to push an agenda. We want to create opportunities for diverse stakeholders to come together in dialogue, to build bridges of understanding, to build a research base and to communicate it through various means. Right now, it's hard to trust facts. And so how do we bring together the best knowledge we have in a way that it will be used? We want to make sure that there is an opportunity for people to have that discussion and to use that discussion to move legislation forward. So there could be areas where there already is bipartisanship. There could be areas where right now we don't have bipartisanship, but there are shared values. And so we can work on shared values to then move it towards a common legislative frame.
So in looking at what you guys have expressed as kind of early priority areas and in that lane, I want to ask you about one thing that is in there and one that isn't. We'll start with what isn't, because when you look at just specifically what you guys have put out there about the agreed upon challenges, the agreed upon solutions, there's very little mention of race and racial disproportionality. And that's noticeable for two reasons. One is that, given the context that there's a movement to abolish child welfare, and that is fueled in a large part by the belief that the system is racist and that it perpetuates racism. And also in that your polling of the public identifies that 60% of people believe that child welfare decisions around intervention, are influenced by racial biases. In the findings brief about your assessment, your landscape assessment, you note that, political tensions heighten in the field when you discuss racial inequities, LGBTQ plus youth, responses to families in poverty, and that these can stall progress. So I guess all that to ask you, how would you describe the initiative's approach to incorporating discussions of racial disproportionality and disparity and solutions specifically around addressing that in what you guys are going to work on?
I can't imagine any issue that we would try to tackle that does not involve looking at racial disproportionality and understanding it. And so it is not called out separately because it is infused into every aspect of the work. So calling it out doesn't necessarily add to an agenda. It just calls it out for the sake of calling it out. So, for example, as we look at the definitions of neglect, how does defining neglect have differences in disproportionality? if we make changes to that, if we change the way that we investigate child abuse and neglect, if we change the way that we report child abuse and neglect, will it lead to less disparities?
So just following up on that, right? So to read that landscape assessment again, political tensions heighten when discussions around race, LGBTQ plus status, poverty, that can stall. Would it be fair to say that, are you guys basically saying that, we are certainly not denying that these are real problems, but we are going to focus on solutions that we believe will impact those favorably and which there are more consensus and less tension around? Or is that not fair?
So I think it's fair to say that we're leading with the research and the data. And so the research and data will show where there are challenges in the system. It will be hard in any part of the system to identify a problem where there is not disparities. Understanding why there are disparities and what can be done to eliminate them will be part of the discussion, regardless of the topic.
So the one that's in there a lot is the Family First Act, Family First Prevention Services Act, which nobody calls that, Family First Act, and the barriers. I've shied away from asking you what you think. I know you're here to represent the initiative, but what do you think are the most significant things to tackle if Family First is going to be a success? Which I think there are a meaningful amount of people, probably on both sides, that feel like this isn't going to do what people hope it's going to do.
Yeah, and the reason that we prioritize Family First as a current policy where implementation of the policy is critical. So there are areas where there may be new policy that's necessary to clarify, to provide flexibility. But here we have an existing policy. It was hard to talk to almost any stakeholder without Family First coming up in the discussion. There is tremendous support for the ideals of Family First, still some excitement about the prospect of it, and then lots of consternation, lots of concern about it not occurring the way they hoped, about the flexibility that states have, both on the prevention side and on the back end with placements in residential care. So as a starting point, we want to understand and communicate the challenges that states are having with federal lawmakers, and to be a bridge between what the federal government is saying and what the states are seeing.
I'm curious from your stakeholder groups whether you talked a lot about the nature of entries into the system, because I'll say one thing that I feel like I've talked to you about this, one thing that's really jumped out to me as we've covered, probably the only media group that's covering what gets into the clearinghouse, right? That's not going to make it out to the Washington Post, but I think I would have guessed that a large block of what would come in there would really have been targeted at helping parents address substance use or their mental health. I'm not saying there isn't that, but it's a lot of services that have been approved thus far that focus on child behavioral health and mental health and things like that. And so that surprised me on one level, but it sure seems like, in particular with older youth, that maybe that was fortuitous timing, because there's quite a bit of a nexus here now between who's coming into foster care and child behavior. So are you hearing that is a sense, like there's a sense that that's changed and that we are seeing that more as a driver into foster care, or not?
That's a
that was question. A very circuitous route I took. I apologize.
No, that's quite all right. Let me start with sort of what we hear about Family First in general. And I think this gets to one of the themes from the landscape assessment, which is systems feel overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed for many, many reasons, but they are feeling as if there is constant policy change, constant change of direction, and they're exhausted. And so they want to take a step back and to try to think, all right, how do we improve what we're doing in the short term while we keep a vision for the future of larger scale reform? So those two things do not have to be incompatible. But their immediate focus is, how do we get our jobs done today? And so they're a little frustrated, I think, with the pace of Family First because of how much is happening at the same time. The workforce crisis, which we talk about in the landscape assessment, now people might suggest, well, that's an evergreen issue. We've had workforce challenges as long as you or I have been alive. But the people we spoke to talked about it in a very different way. They talked about it as much more severe and a tremendous limiting factor to the ability to implement something like Family First, particularly not necessarily just in the government realm, but in the community realm. If you don't have providers who have the capacity to implement evidence-based programs, then how are you going to be able to draw down additional resources to fund it? Also, when you have a harder time doing your day-to-day job, the idea of doing something innovative, as much as you want to, as much as you support it, it's a real challenge to wrap your head around doing that as well. As far as the reasons why families are coming into the system and the question around older youth, I did not hear that a lot beyond the question of, oh my goodness, we have a youth mental health crisis. And that when we say the word youth, it may not necessarily just be teenagers. That youth may go down to a younger age. So that is definitely something we heard a lot about. Whether that is the primary reason why families are coming into child welfare, that there may be a lag there, but we didn't hear that.
Oh, no, it's certainly
loudly.
not that it's become, some main driver. But, for example, I think, there's a huge, I think an issue that a lot of states are facing is they're having a very hard time with appropriate placements, safe placements, particularly for older youth. And at least in the instance of Texas, which has struggled mightily with that, a very large percent, I want to say it was 25 to 30% of that child without placement, they came into the system as a result only of mental health crises, and there was no finding of maltreatment, and so that's a different deal.
Yeah.
However you want to cut it.
Yeah, the Annie Casey Foundation did a lot of work looking specifically at that issue, and they wrote a publication years ago called Too Many Teens, which really attacked this issue to show, do we really want birth families to quote unquote voluntarily access child welfare because they can't find mental health services either for themselves or their children? That's not really what the system was meant to do, probably not what we want. And yet there was evidence, and I think there continues to be evidence, that when you have greater access to mental health by being involved in child welfare, people are going to get involved to be able to take care of their kids.
Yeah, and I think one thing you said that really seems true from what we've reported, conversations we've had, is like that the workforce issue in the provider level, community provider level, is a big problem. Because if you just look at the front end proposition of Family First in a fairly simplistic way, there's always been requirements to make reasonable efforts to prevent removal, and there's not really been money for it. And so like on one level, it's just sort of like making that right. But that's not really possible to just say, okay, well, now we've got some money to do it, let's go do it, if you don't have people that will get trained in motivational interviewing or nurse family partner, like they're just having a hard time finding the people to do it. That's never going to happen.
I'll step out of my BPC role for a second and say that as someone who's been involved in the system for a very long time, I may have a different view of Family First than others, in the sense that I have a little bit more patience for how long it's going to take to make such a large change. Family First has already changed the conversation in ways that I think are important, even if it hasn't changed all the funding, all the services, all the supports. Would we be having the same level of depth in our discussions about prevention if we didn't have a potential funding source? I'm not sure we would. So I think there are some good things that are happening as far as the conversation. The vision will be maybe 10, 20 years before we fully realize it, but it doesn't necessarily make me sad. It says, all right, this is sort of the normal course of development. The federal government, for a variety of reasons, had a little bit of a delay in providing guidance and approving programs and improving plans. That's sort of a natural course of development when a huge federal piece of legislation moves forward.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Like, however you feel about what it does and doesn't do as a law, to think that even in a pristine, normal time, there'd be this huge uptake in a 5-year window. Not really what history has shown. Like if you think of the last big opt-in law extending foster care kin gap, as you know, now there's probably like 49 states have some semblance of an extended foster care, probably 30 have it with like the federal participation. I think my sense is like kin gap is still kind of struggling on true uptake. Like everybody kind of opted in, but like not everybody's using it. So 5 years kind of way too soon to tell on just actually using it. Yeah. All right. So I think we'll drop a lot of links to what the Bipartisan Center has already produced here. And, stay tuned for more coming out of their shop. So Rob Geen, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Rob Geen of the Child Welfare Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would really appreciate it if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories of child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly. See you next week.